On the afternoon of April the 6th, 1965, the Chancellor of the Exchequer rose in the House of Commons to deliver a budget speech that everyone in the chamber expected to be about taxation, sterling, and the broader management of a fragile British economy. James Callaghan covered income tax, corporation tax, the balance of payments, and the troubled state of the pound. And then, late in his statement, almost as a fiscal afterthought, he announced the cancellation of the most advanced military aircraft Britain had ever attempted to build. The Conservative benches erupted. Conservative members rose immediately to demand that the Defence Secretary make a separate statement, rather than have such a decision buried inside a financial speech. The Speaker brought them to order. Far away from Westminster, at the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment near Boscombe Down, a test pilot named Jimmy Dell was preparing to make the maiden flight of the second prototype. A faulty fuel pump had needed replacing that morning, so Dell had walked up the road to a social club in Amesbury for lunch. He heard the cancellation announcement on the television set above the bar. He rushed back to the airfield, but it was already too late. He never flew the aircraft. No one ever would. The aircraft was the BAC TSR-2, the tactical strike and reconnaissance machine designed for Mach 2 performance. Only one airframe had ever taken to the sky. It had completed 24 test flights across roughly 13 hours of accumulated flight time over a period of 6 months. Its chief test pilot had described its handling as marvellous. It had exceeded the speed of sound on dry power, without afterburner, on its 14th flight. It had outpaced a Lightning interceptor in full reheat, and then, on a single April afternoon, it was killed by a sentence in a financial speech. Within months, the prototypes that had not flown were dismembered for gunnery practice on the mudflats at Shoebury Ness. The wooden mock-up at Warton was reportedly burned. The production jigs at Brooklands were broken up. Decades later, surviving aviation engineers would still describe what happened in 1965 as the moment a generation of British aerospace ambition was buried alive. This is the story of how that happened, and why. The strategic problem the TSR-2 was created to solve had been forming since the early 1950s. The English Electric Canberra, a twin-jet bomber that had entered Royal Air Force service in May 1951 with 101 Squadron at Royal Air Force Binbrook, was the finest aircraft of its kind in the world when it appeared. It was fast, it was elegant, it could fly higher than almost any potential interceptor of its generation. The Americans had liked it so much they built it under license as the B-57. But the men who planned the future of British air power knew an uncomfortable truth. By the middle of the decade, the Canberra was already living on borrowed time. As early as February 1952, Air Vice Marshal Geoffrey Tuttle had written in an Air Ministry minute that the aircraft was already out of date, and that he doubted its chances of survival in daylight against the latest Soviet fighters then entering service. The reason was simple. The Soviet Union was deploying surface-to-air missiles in numbers, and high altitude was no longer a sanctuary. It was rapidly becoming a death sentence. The air staff began studying the problem in 1955. The basic conclusion was that any aircraft hoping to penetrate Soviet airspace in a future war would have to do so at very low altitude, ideally below 200 feet, where it could hide beneath the radar horizon and slip beneath the engagement envelopes of high-altitude missiles. But low-altitude flight created its own problems. It demanded astonishingly accurate navigation, since the pilot would be operating in conditions where a moment of confusion could mean a hillside instead of a target. It demanded protection against terrain, since flying that low at high speed in cloud or at night was suicide without an automated system to keep the aircraft above the rocks. And it demanded the kind of structural strength and aerodynamic refinement that would let an airframe absorb the punishment of low-level turbulence at transonic speeds without shaking itself to pieces. The General Operational Requirement, designated GOR 339, was issued in November 1956 and circulated to industry in March 1957. A refined version, Operational Requirement 343, received its official go-ahead on January 1, 1959. The Minister of Supply gave the project its name a few weeks later. Tactical Strike and Reconnaissance Mach 2, or simply TSR-2. The threat that the requirement was designed to defeat was made painfully concrete on May 1, 1960, when a Soviet SA-2 missile destroyed the high-flying American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft piloted by Francis Gary Powers. The shoot-down did not create the demand for a low-level strike aircraft. That demand had existed for years, but it confirmed every assumption the Royal Air Force planners had been making about the future of aerial penetration. The age of high-altitude invulnerability was finished. The future belonged to whoever could fly fastest, lowest, and most precisely beneath the new umbrella of radar-guided weapons. Building such an aircraft demanded converging breakthroughs in half a dozen disciplines simultaneously. The propulsion had to be brutally powerful, capable of supersonic dash at altitude and sustained low-level cruise without throttle changes that would betray the aircraft to enemy listening posts. The wing had to combine high-speed performance with the ability to operate from short, semi-prepared runways, since the Great Royal Air Force airfields of Lincolnshire would be among the first targets in any conflict. The avionics had to include a forward-looking radar capable of automatically reading the terrain ahead and feeding commands to the autopilot, a device which in 1957 existed nowhere in the world as an operational system. The aircraft had to be able to deliver a thermonuclear weapon at supersonic speed in any weather, day or night by automatic computation. And it had to do all of this while being affordable for a country that had emerged from the Second World War financially exhausted and was watching its empire dissolve faster than its industrial base could be reorganized. No one had ever built such a thing. 8 British firms were invited to try. The competition was complicated from the beginning by political pressure for industrial consolidation. On April 4, 1957, Defence Minister Duncan Sandys had presented a white paper to Parliament that argued ballistic missiles and surface-to-air weapons were rendering manned combat aircraft obsolete. Several major projects, including the Avro 730, the F-155 Interceptor competition and the Saunders Roe SR-177, were cancelled outright. The TSR-2 requirement survived only because the V-bomber force still required a tactical complement and because the work was already advanced. But the white paper made one thing clear. The British government would no longer fund competing airframes from a fragmented industry. The companies would have to merge. 13 submissions were received by the end of January 1958. The English Electric P-17A, with its radical concept of vertical launch from a shorts platform. The Vickers Armstrong's Type 571. The Bristol Type 204. The Avro 739. The Hawker P-1129. A navalised Buccaneer derivative from Blackburn. By February 1958, the field had narrowed to 3 combinations. The Vickers approach was admired for treating the airframe as a single integrated weapons system, rather than as a platform on which equipment was bolted. The English Electric design was preferred aerodynamically. The Ministry of Supply forced a marriage. Vickers would build the front fuselage at Weybridge. English Electric would build the rear at Warton and Samlesbury. They would do this together as a single corporate entity. Vickers Armstrong's Aircraft, English Electric Aviation, and Bristol Aeroplane Company duly merged through 1960 to form the British Aircraft Corporation, with Hunting Aircraft acquired later that same year. The development contract for the prototype airframes was signed on October 6, 1960. Sir George Edwards, who had led the Vickers Valiant and Viscount programmes, became the new corporation's aircraft division chief from the start, was appointed managing director in 1964, and rose to chairman in 1968. He had built some of the most successful British aircraft of the previous decade. He would now lead what should have been the most successful programme of the next. The aircraft his teams designed was extraordinary. It was 89 feet long with a small shoulder-mounted delta wing of around 700 square feet and a wingspan of just over 37 feet. The wingtips drooped slightly downward, a feature borrowed from supersonic aerodynamic research that smoothed pressure distribution at high speed. There were no ailerons. Roll was achieved by differential movement of the slab tailplane, an arrangement called tailerons. The fin was all moving. Across the entire trailing edge of the wing ran full-span flaps that were blown by high-pressure air bled directly from the engines, a system that allowed the aircraft to take off and land in spaces that conventional supersonic designs could never have managed. 2 Bristol Siddeley Olympus engines in the variant designated Mach 320 sat side by side in the rear fuselage. Each was rated at approximately 19,600 pounds of thrust dry, rising to around 30,600 pounds with afterburner. The maximum takeoff weight was a little over 103,000 pounds. The maximum sustained speed at altitude was Mach 2.05. The dash limit set by leading edge heating at 140 degrees Celsius was Mach 2.35. At low level, it could maintain Mach 1.1 to 1.2 while threading between hills. The internal weapons bay was 20 feet long, capable of carrying up to 4 British WE-177 nuclear weapons in combination with underwing pylons, or 6 conventional 1,000-pound bombs. Total ordnance load reached 10,000 pounds, 6,000 internal and 4,000 external. But it was the avionics fit, more than the airframe or the engines, that placed the TSR-2 in a category of its own. Ferranti developed a forward-looking terrain following radar that was among the first of its kind in the world, capable of feeding climb and descent commands directly to the autopilot, allowing the aircraft to fly hands-off at 200 feet over hilly country in any visibility. A sideways-looking radar from EMI would refine navigation by reading ground features as the aircraft flew. An Autonetics Verdan digital flight control computer, of the same family used in the American A5 Vigilante, was modified for British conditions by Elliott Automation. Around these central systems sat a Doppler navigation set from Decca, a moving map display projected from 35mm film, an integrated NavAttack computation suite, and a head-up display, among the earliest operational installations of such a device in any aircraft anywhere. Most of this equipment, however, was never installed in the prototype that flew. That fact would matter later. While British engineers were building the TSR-2, the major air powers were attempting to solve similar problems in their own ways. In the United States, General Dynamics was developing the F-111, a variable geometry aircraft whose wings could sweep forward for short field performance and back for supersonic dash. Its first flight came on December 21st, 1964, 3 months after the TSR-2 had already taken to the air. The American approach traded one set of complications for another. Variable geometry was mechanically complex and added weight. France was producing the Dassault Mirage 4, a strategic nuclear bomber that was elegant and fast but had nothing like the range or low-level penetration capability the British requirement demanded. The Soviet Union was developing what would eventually become the Sukhoi Su-24, an aircraft that would not enter service until the 1970s. None of these contemporaries combined what the TSR-2 attempted to combine in a single airframe. The British design was, on paper and in concept, ahead of all of them. The trouble was that being ahead in concept and being ahead in delivered hardware are two different things, and the gap between them is measured in money and time. The flaw in the TSR-2 was therefore not aerodynamic, nor structural, nor electronic. The flaw was political and structural in a different sense. The aircraft had been born under the shadow of a white paper that had declared its category obsolete. It survived only because circumstances had not yet caught up with the ideology. From its first day, it was a permanent target for any future government looking for savings, any service rival looking for resources, any Treasury official looking for something expensive to cut. The forced merger that had created its manufacturer had brought together two engineering cultures that did not naturally cooperate. Vickers at Weybridge with its history of integrated systems, thinking inherited from the Valiant. English Electric at Warton with its purer aerodynamic instincts inherited from the Lightning. Building one aircraft across two sites with subcontractors employed not by the corporation but directly by the ministry created lines of authority that no single manager controlled. Roland Beamont, the chief test pilot who would later make the aircraft's maiden flight, identified this structural arrangement as a primary cause of the cost overruns that would eventually doom the program. Other contractors had been making decisions about TSR-2 equipment without anyone at the British Aircraft Corporation having authority to discipline them. Costs, accordingly, did not rise. They erupted. The first cost estimates in the late 1950s had placed the development effort somewhere between £35 million and £90 million, depending on which document one consulted. By December 1962, the figure had climbed to between 175 and 200 million. By January 1964, it stood between 240 and 260 million. And these were development costs alone, not the cost of acquiring the aircraft in operational numbers. Each successive Conservative administration absorbed the increases reluctantly. Reginald Maudling at the Treasury and Peter Thornycroft at Defence were both Conservative ministers who knew that cancelling the TSR-2 would be politically catastrophic for their party. They paid the bills, gritted their teeth, and waited for the aircraft to fly. It nearly did not. The Olympus engine, originally developed by Bristol in the late 1940s and used to power the Avro Vulcan from 1956 onwards, suffered a cascade of development problems specific to the high-thrust variant the TSR-2 required. By early 1964, repeated failures had accumulated, by some accounts as many as 11 in roughly 15 months, leaving the engine months behind schedule. On December 3, 1962, the Avro Vulcan that was being used as an airborne testbed for Olympus development, registration XA894, was destroyed during a full-power ground run at Filton when a low-pressure turbine disc disintegrated and ruptured the fuel tanks. The crew survived. In July 1964, another low-pressure turbine shaft failed on a ground test stand, the fourth such failure in the programme. The clearance between the engine bay walls and the engine itself was just 0.3 of an inch. Engineers needed custom-built feeler gauges to install them. An engine change, when it became necessary, could take 24 hours. There was an old test pilot's maxim, much repeated at the British Aircraft Corporation during these years and endorsed by Beamont himself. One could safely develop a new aircraft with a tested engine or a tested aircraft with a new engine, but never both at once. The TSR-2 was attempting both. At a meeting on September 26, 1964, the company's senior leadership and the test pilot agreed that the aircraft could fly the next day with the engines that were currently fitted, on the understanding that those engines were not certified airworthy and would be replaced before any second flight. Beamont's own recorded comment was that, given the mounting political pressures on the programme, it might be acceptable to take this level of risk for one flight only. The maiden flight took place from Boscombe Down on September 27, 1964. The aircraft sat on the apron in the all-white anti-flash paint scheme common to British nuclear strike aircraft of that era. Beamont was in the front seat. His navigator, Don Bowen, sat behind him. A Lightning T Mark IV chase aircraft flown by Jimmy Dell waited in the climb pattern, with a Canberra following as a second observer. A Westland Whirlwind helicopter circled nearby for emergency rescue. The flight lasted approximately 14 to 15 minutes. The undercarriage remained extended throughout, since retraction had not yet been cleared. The aircraft was limited to 250 knots and 10,000 feet. Beamont climbed away in afterburner, with the gear hanging, completed a series of gentle handling checks at around 6,000 feet, and brought the aircraft back through a long final approach. On touchdown, the undercarriage shook violently in a phenomenon known as shimmy, a vibration severe enough to cause concern about structural damage. The aircraft taxied in. Beamont reported that the handling had been marvellous. The first flight had succeeded. The second flight did not occur for more than 3 months. The engines had to be modified, then reinstalled. On December 31, 1964, Beamont took the aircraft up again at 20 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, late in the day with light already failing. Almost immediately he noticed that his forward vision was deteriorating. He thought at first that low winter sun was glaring through the canopy, but the instrument panel in front of him had also become blurred. He realized that his eyes themselves were vibrating. The starboard engine was producing a high-frequency oscillation that happened to coincide with the resonant frequency of the human eyeball. The engineers later traced the problem to a fuel pump that had gone out of balance, but in the cockpit, Beamont knew only that his vision was disintegrating. He throttled back the affected engine, identified the speed range over which the vibration occurred, and brought the aircraft back to land on a single engine, an asymmetric approach in an unfamiliar prototype that called for considerable nerve. Subsequent flights revealed undercarriage retraction failures. On the fifth flight, the main bogies jammed in the vertical position during retraction. Beamont offered Don Bowen the opportunity to use the Martin Baker ejection seat. Bowen declined. Beamont then talked his way back to a careful landing using a long, gentle approach at a sink rate of just over 10 centimeters per second, allowing the weight of the aircraft on touchdown to rotate the bogies into the correct orientation. By the 10th flight, the gear retracted cleanly for the first time, and Beamont followed the success with a low pass down the Boscombe Down runway at approximately 450 knots, around 550 miles per hour at 100 feet. Witnesses described the noise as a rolling thunder. The control, Beamont said afterwards, had been beautiful. Then came the 14th flight. On February 22, 1965, the aircraft was scheduled to fly from Boscombe Down to the British Aircraft Corporation's airfield at Warton in Lancashire for the next phase of trials. Beamont was joined in the back seat by Peter Moneypenny, his navigator for that sortie. He took it up with one of the two reheat fuel pumps unserviceable, meaning he could only use afterburner on a single engine. He climbed away, accelerated, and exceeded the speed of sound on dry thrust alone, a form of supersonic cruise that very few aircraft of any nation could perform in that era. His chase aircraft, a Lightning T Mark IV trainer flown by Jimmy Dell with both engines in full reheat, struggled to keep up. When Beamont lit his single available afterburner, he accelerated away from the Lightning. The maximum speed reported on that flight was Mach 1.12. On the same flight, he descended to 200 feet over the Pennine Hills and held the aircraft steady at low-level supersonic cruise, the very profile the Royal Air Force had specified 7 years earlier. The aircraft did everything that had been asked of it. There were 24 flights in total. The last took place on March 31st, 1965. Across those flights, totaling roughly 13 hours in the air, the prototype demonstrated outstanding handling, exceptional low-level stability, and the aerodynamic characteristics that had been promised on paper. Beamont, an experienced test pilot who had flown the Hurricane in combat, the Tempest, the Canberra and the Lightning, stated unambiguously that the TSR-2 handled better than any of them. Dell described it as flying like a big lightning. The pilots and engineers who saw the aircraft fly believed they were witnessing the future of British military aviation. They were wrong. The future belonged to whoever could survive the politics, and the politics had already turned. Labour had won the general election of October 1964 with a Commons majority of just 4 seats. The new Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, faced an inherited balance of payments deficit of around £800 million and a sterling crisis that was building toward the eventual devaluation of 1967. His new Defence Secretary, Dennis Healey, had taken office determined to bring military procurement under tighter control. His new Aviation Minister, Roy Jenkins, had inherited a portfolio of expensive aircraft programs that were collectively eating an unsustainable share of the defence budget. In late November 1964, Wilson and Healey travelled to Washington, where Defence Secretary Robert McNamara discussed the possibility of supplying the F-111 to the Royal Air Force, on terms that British negotiators believed would deliver each aircraft at around £5 million, well below the cost the Americans were paying for their own examples. The Conservative opposition would later argue this offer was misleading because it failed to account for research and development recovery. What mattered politically in late 1964 was that the American option had become tangible and apparently affordable. There were forces inside the British defence establishment pushing in the same direction. Sir Solly Zuckerman, who had become Chief Scientific Advisor to Her Majesty's government in October 1964, having previously held the equivalent position at the Ministry of Defence, had long been sceptical of the British aerospace industry's ability to deliver complex projects on time and on budget. He used his expanded influence to argue that British procurement should rely more heavily on proven American hardware. Lord Mountbatten, the Chief of the Defence Staff, had spent years advocating for an alternative to TSR-2. His preferred solution was a development of the Royal Navy's Blackburn Buccaneer, a low-level strike aircraft already in service that he argued could fulfill much of the same mission at a fraction of the cost. According to long-standing aviation folklore, Mountbatten lobbied Australian officials in 1963, principally during a London visit by the Royal Australian Air Force Chief Air Marshal Sir Frederick Sherger, by producing photographs of Buccaneers and TSR-2s to demonstrate that 5 Buccaneers could be bought for the price of 1 TSR-2. The literal version of this story, in which he produced the photographs like playing cards on a desk, is anecdotal and has no clear documentary source. What is well documented is that the underlying argument was real, and that Mountbatten made it forcefully wherever he had an audience. Senior airmen of the period were reported to believe he was abusing his position to advance Royal Navy interests at the expense of the Royal Air Force. The accusation appears in subsequent biographical accounts of Mountbatten, where his airman colleagues regarded his lobbying as an unwarranted intrusion into matters that should have been settled by the air staff alone. The Royal Air Force itself was not as united in defence of the project as later legend would suggest. An internal report in October 1964 had described the TSR-2's cost as its outstanding and all-pervading shortcoming. Some senior officers had begun to wonder privately whether the aircraft was simply too expensive to procure in militarily useful numbers. If the choice was between a small fleet of TSR-2s and a larger fleet of F-111s, the latter began to seem the lesser evil to officers whose first concern was operational capability rather than industrial sovereignty. The cancellation came in stages. On February 2, 1965, Wilson announced that 2 other British aircraft programs would be cancelled. The Hawker Siddeley 681 transport would be replaced by the American C-130 Hercules. The Hawker Siddeley P-1154 supersonic vertical takeoff fighter would be replaced by the McDonnell Phantom in its British variants. These cancellations were the warning. In the weeks that followed, the British Aircraft Corporation began to understand what was coming. Workers from the Lancashire factories organised themselves into a protest, gathering in Hyde Park to march against the threatened closure of their industry. A 9-man delegation travelled overnight from Lancashire to Whitehall, intent on confronting Roy Jenkins, the Aviation Minister, in his office. These were not negotiators or trade union officials trained in political combat. These were men who built aircraft, fitters and inspectors, and draftsmen who had come to plead in person for their livelihoods. When they arrived at the ministry, they were told that Jenkins was unable to receive them. He had a full diary of unbreakable engagements. His parliamentary secretary, John Stonehouse, met them in his place. Stonehouse had nothing meaningful to tell them. They were given polite words and sent home. On April 1, 1965, in 2 cabinet meetings, the decision was taken to cancel the TSR-2 and to take a non-binding option on up to 110 F-111s from General Dynamics. 5 days later, on April 6, the Chancellor announced the decision in his budget speech. The British Aircraft Corporation was not informed in advance, nor permitted to brief its own management. The information was treated as a budget secret until the moment Callaghan stood up in the chamber. The political storm that followed was severe but brief. On April 13, 1965, Healey rose in the House of Commons to defend the decision in the formal aircraft project's cancellation debate. He stated that under £100 million had been spent on the TSR-2 when Labour took office. He stated that the in-service date had now slipped into 1968, 2 years later than originally promised. The total bill for research, development and production, he told the House, would have come to about £750 million. On a programme of around 150 aircraft that worked out to approximately £5 million per machine, 20 times the cost of the Canberra it was supposed to replace. He acknowledged that the aircraft firms and the Royal Air Force had understated the original costs. He concluded that he had no doubt about the decision to cancel. In later reflections, he would summarise the underlying problem in a phrase often repeated, that the TSR-2 had tried to combine the most advanced state of every art in every field. Roy Jenkins answered a written parliamentary question on October 27, 1965, in which he confirmed that the total estimated outturn cost of the TSR-2 programme was £195 million, with cancellation charges of approximately £70 million on top of that. Translated into modern equivalents using standard inflation indices, the £195 million figure corresponds to somewhere between £4.5 and £5 billion in today's money, depending on whether the gross domestic product deflator or the retail price index is applied. The full projected programme cost, had it continued to completion, would equate to somewhere between 15 and 19 billion modern pounds. What followed the cancellation was not merely the end of a programme, it was a comprehensive erasure. Within hours of the budget announcement, the consequences began to ripple outward across British industry. At the Weybridge and Warton factories, thousands of skilled workers learned of the decision from radio bulletins. Engineers who had spent the previous decade building components found themselves redundant by the end of the working week. Specialist tooling that had been fabricated to micron-level tolerances for the structural joints of the airframe became, in a single afternoon, scrap metal awaiting collection. Within 6 months, the production jigs at Brooklands had been broken up. The wooden mock-up at Warton was reportedly burned. The completed and partially completed airframes that had not yet flown were sent to the gunnery range at Shoeburyness, where they were used for shrapnel vulnerability tests. The flying prototype XR219 was delivered to Shoeburyness on August 14, 1966, and was finally scrapped after years of weapons effects trials in 1982. Whether the destruction was carried out under specific Whitehall instruction, or whether it followed standard contract termination procedures that would have applied to any cancelled programme, has been argued for decades. The Minister of Technology told the House of Commons in May 1968 that the space at the firms concerned was required, that the jigs therefore had to be removed or destroyed, and that there had been no deliberate action to stop any future government from continuing the project. Critics have remained unconvinced. What is not in dispute is the result. Within a year of the cancellation announcement, almost nothing physical remained of the most advanced aircraft Britain had ever built. 2 complete airframes survived only because they had been allocated to museum collections before the destruction took its full effect. The American option that had been chosen in place of the TSR-2 collapsed with grim symmetry. The British Aircraft Corporation's hopes that the F-111 order might at least be cancelled in favour of resurrecting domestic production were dashed in the 1966 Defence White Paper, which formally selected the F-111K, alongside an Anglo-French variable geometry collaboration. A firm order for 10 F-111s was placed in April 1966, with a further 40 in April 1967. The Anglo-French project collapsed when France withdrew on June 29, 1967. Sterling was devalued in November the same year, raising the per-aircraft cost of the American F-111s substantially in pounds. On January 16, 1968, the British government cancelled the F-111K order entirely. 2 airframes had already been completed at the Fort Worth factory. They were eventually used by the United States Air Force as test aircraft. The British were left with no replacement for the TSR-2 and no F-111 either. They turned with some embarrassment to the very Buccaneer that Lord Mountbatten had been advocating 4 years earlier, ordering 26 new build Buccaneer S.2B aircraft in July 1968. Royal Air Force Buccaneer service began at Honington in October 1969. The McDonnell Phantom, ordered in its British variants, entered Royal Air Force service in 1968 and 1969. Together, the Buccaneer and the Phantom did much of what the TSR-2 had been intended to do, less well, less elegantly, and at the price of considerable national pride. The eventual genuine successor to the TSR-2 appeared 15 years after the cancellation. The Panavia Tornado, developed jointly by the United Kingdom, West Germany and Italy, made its first flight on August 14, 1974. The first production Tornado entered Royal Air Force service in 1980. Roland Beamont, the man who had flown the TSR-2 on its maiden flight, had become Director of Flight Operations for Panavia in 1971. He retired in August 1979 after the maiden flight of the first production aircraft. The Tornado was a smaller machine than the TSR-2 had been, with variable geometry wings rather than blown flaps, and it required the resources of 3 nations rather than 1 to build. It served for nearly 4 decades and was still in frontline use against advanced opponents in the 21st century. It was, in many ways, the aircraft Britain finally got to do the job the TSR-2 had been designed for, but it was no longer a British aircraft. The era when one nation could mount such an effort alone had ended. That ending had been formalised within months of the TSR-2's cancellation. In December 1965, the Plowden Committee on the British aircraft industry published its report, recommending the very approach that had been taken with the Tornado a decade later. Britain, the report argued, could no longer afford to develop advanced military aircraft entirely on its own. The future lay in collaborative European projects, in pooled research and development costs, in shared production lines spread across multiple nations. The Concorde supersonic airliner, already underway as an Anglo-French partnership, was the prototype of what was coming. The Jaguar strike trainer, agreed with France in 1965 and entering service in 1973, was the first military expression of the new model. The Tornado was the second, much larger one. Decades later, the Eurofighter Typhoon and the various Airbus partnerships would extend the same logic into the 21st century. The Plowden report did not cause this shift. The cancellation of the TSR-2 did, by demonstrating in the most visible possible way that the old British model of indigenous development had become unaffordable. What was killed in April 1965 was not only an aircraft but an entire conception of how Britain related to its own industrial capability. The question that has haunted the TSR-2 story for 60 years is why it happened. Cost was the official reason, and it was a real reason. The figures were genuinely alarming. Healy's concerns were not invented for political theatre, but cost alone cannot explain the totality of what occurred. Several other forces were at work, and any honest account of the cancellation must acknowledge them all. The first was the long shadow of the 1957 White Paper. Duncan Sandys had declared a category of weapon obsolete, and although the immediate cancellations had spared the TSR-2, the ideological framing meant that the project was always operating against the prevailing wisdom of senior defence intellectuals. Each time costs rose, the question was not merely whether the aircraft was worth its price, but whether any manned strike aircraft was worth its price. That framing was poison to a programme that needed steady political support across multiple administrations. The second was the structure of British aerospace itself. The forced merger that created the British Aircraft Corporation had not produced a unified engineering culture. It had produced two factories, two managerial traditions, and a contracting arrangement in which the most expensive subsystems were procured directly by the ministry rather than through the prime contractor. No one in the corporation had the authority to discipline the firms supplying the avionics, the engines, the radar, or the computer. Costs cascaded because there was no chain of command capable of containing them. This was a structural failure, not a personal one, but it produced the budget overruns that gave the cancellation its arithmetic justification. The third was inter-service rivalry. The Royal Navy, with Mountbatten as its most influential advocate at the Chiefs of Staff level, had a strong interest in seeing the Buccaneer adopted by the Royal Air Force. Every pound spent on TSR-2 was a pound not spent on naval aviation. Every operational role taken by the Royal Air Force was a role denied to the carriers. The argument that 5 Buccaneers could be bought for the price of one TSR-2 was misleading in its simplifications, since the two aircraft were not designed to do the same job. But the argument was rhetorically powerful, and it was made repeatedly to ministers who lacked the technical background to evaluate it independently. The fourth was the influence of Sir Solly Zuckerman and the broader scientific establishment that distrusted British industrial competence. Zuckerman was not motivated by malice, he was motivated by a belief, formed across years of observing British aerospace projects deliver late and over budget, that the country could no longer afford to develop indigenous solutions to every problem. He argued for buying off the shelf from the Americans where possible. His advice was honest. It was also, in the case of the TSR-2, premature. The aircraft was already flying, and the flight test results were vindicating the design. The fifth was financial. Britain in 1964 and 1965 was a country in fiscal crisis. The pound was under pressure. The balance of payments was disastrous. The new Labour government had been elected on promises of social spending that could not be honoured if defence absorbed disproportionate resources. Some popular accounts have argued that the United States exploited this position by linking financial support for sterling to the cancellation of competitive British aerospace programmes. This theory has circulated for decades but has never been corroborated by primary documentary evidence in either British or American archives, and it should be treated as an allegation rather than as an established fact. What is clear is that the broader context made expensive defence projects politically vulnerable in ways they would not have been in calmer financial times. The sixth and final factor was ambition itself. The TSR-2 had attempted to leap a generation in a single aircraft. It had tried to introduce in one airframe an operational terrain following radar that few other nations had even attempted, one of the world's first operational head-up displays, an integrated digital flight control computer, a sideways-looking radar, a Doppler navigation system, and a structural design pushing the limits of titanium fabrication. Each individual subsystem was a genuine engineering frontier. Combining them meant accepting that some would be late, some would fail, and some would cost more than projected. A more conservative aircraft, settling for proven systems with a single significant innovation, would have been cheaper and might have been acceptable. The British had built such aircraft before. They had succeeded with the Canberra by being ambitious within bounds. With the TSR-2, they tried to be ambitious without bounds, and the politics of the country in the mid-1960s was not steady enough to absorb the price. What survived of the project survived almost by accident. 2 complete airframes exist today. XR-220, the second prototype that was prepared for its maiden flight on the very day of the cancellation announcement, sits in the National Cold War exhibition at the Royal Air Force Museum at Cosford. XR-222 is at the Imperial War Museum at Duxford. The forward fuselage section used for ejection seat trials is preserved at Brooklands. Visitors who approach these aircraft for the first time often remark on how modern they look, how clean the lines are, how unmistakably the design belongs to a category of aircraft that the world has continued to use for the last 50 years. They are looking at what might have been, not at a museum piece, but at a glimpse of an alternative history in which Britain remained capable of building such things alone. Sir Sidney Cam, the legendary designer of the Hawker Hurricane, is widely reported to have remarked in the months between the cancellation and his own death in March 1966 that all modern aircraft have 4 dimensions: span, length, height, and politics. The TSR-2, he observed, simply got the first 3 right. It is the most quoted line in the entire history of the project, and it is repeated so often because it captures the truth in a way that no longer technical analysis can. An aircraft is more than its airframe. It is the social system that produces it, the political consensus that funds it, the institutional culture that sustains it through years of development. Get the engineering right and the politics wrong, and what you have built will fly 24 times and then be cut up for scrap. There is a tendency in the popular telling of this story to cast Dennis Healey as a villain, as a man who killed an aircraft out of malice or partisan calculation. The historical record does not support this. Healey believed, on the basis of the figures presented to him, that the project could not be afforded. He defended this position consistently from 1965 until his death in 2015. In his memoirs, he expressed regret about the decision to substitute the F-111, but no regret about the cancellation of the TSR-2 itself. Whether his judgment was correct will be argued among historians for as long as the subject is studied. What is clear is that his decision was made in good faith, on grounds that any responsible defence minister would have had to weigh seriously. The fault, if fault is the right word, was distributed across a system that had grown too ambitious, too fragmented, and too politically exposed to deliver what its engineers had designed. 24 flights, 13 hours of flying time. 1 aircraft that exceeded the speed of sound on dry power and outpaced a Lightning in reheat. 1 aircraft that demonstrated, in the brief window before it was killed, that a country of 50 million people could still produce something the superpowers struggled to match. And then a single sentence in a financial speech, and silence. The TSR-2 is the aircraft Britain built and Britain destroyed. Its prototypes rest now under museum lights where children point at them and ask what they were, and adults who know the answer find themselves struggling to explain why a working aircraft of such evident capability was reduced to a target on a mudflat. There is no clean answer. There is only the long story of how a piece of engineering that nearly transcended its era was undone by the era itself, by the politics of a country in crisis, by the rivalries of services and ministers, and by the simple weight of having tried to do too much all at once in conditions that could not bear it. That is the story of the TSR-2, and it remains, 60 years later, the most expensive lesson British aerospace ever paid for.